Good evening. Welcome to Politics and Prose. We're very excited to have with us here tonight Dina Hampton. She'll be discussing her new book, Little Red. Hampton's Little Red tells us the story of the Little Red Schoolhouse and Elizabeth Irwin High School through the lives of three of its most influential graduates. In the 1960s, three Little Redders became leaders of their respective movements. There was Angela Davis, an African-American communist who became the face of the Black Power movement, Tom Hurwitz, SDS activist and filmmaker, and finally Elliott Abrams, who played a key role in the Reagan and W. Bush administrations, bucking the liberalism that he learned at Little Red. Little Red's progressive approach to education helped create these very different leaders who each tried to perfect the world in their own way. Ladies and gentlemen, Dina Hampton.
Hello. I'm very excited to be here tonight at Politics and Prose to share with you the lives of the three extraordinary people in my book, Angela Davis, as Jennifer said, Tom Hurwitz, and Elliott Abrams, who converged at a time, quite improbably really, considering their different backgrounds, at a tiny progressive radical school in the early 1960s, Little Red Schoolhouse and Elizabeth Irwin High School. Angela Davis was the African-American revolutionary and academic who would become the face of Black Power movement in the 1970s. She would become a cause célèbre when she landed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and stood trial for murder and kidnapping in connection with an attempted jailbreak in Marin County in California. And she would also run for vice president twice on the CPUSA ticket. Tom Hurwitz, who's perhaps the least known of the three of my protagonists, was born to a distinguished Old Left family in New York City. He would become a prominent member of the New Left and be instrumental in the 1968 occupation of Columbia University and also in the anti-war movement in California. Finally, Elliott Abrams was the child of a middle-class family in Queens, New York, and entered Elizabeth Irwin, and answering the question, how do you rebel against a radical school, railed against what seemed to him the outrageously left-wing bias of the students and the teachers. So I'll just give you a quick history of the school, which was founded in 1932 by a remarkable woman named Elizabeth Irwin. She was born in 1880 to a well-to-do family, went to Smith College, and moved to Greenwich Village in 1903, which, if I had a time machine, I would love to do myself, because she found herself among a group of artists and radicals and social reformers and free thinkers and educators that made up the first generation of Greenwich Village bohemians. Eugene O'Neill, Emma Goldman, John Reed, Margaret Sanger, so many others, Edna St. Vincent Millay. Irwin began her adult life as a freelance reporter, and then studied as a psychologist and a social worker inspired by the philosophy of John Dewey. She ran a series of model classes within the public education system in New York on the Lower East Side, mostly with the children of Eastern European immigrants. And she and her fellow progressive educators, and there were quite a concentration of them in Lower Manhattan at the time, they railed against the rote memorization method of teaching and the strict discipline of the day. She believed that children should be able to learn to read and write on their own schedule. She believed that a child's emotional development was as important as his intellectual development. And one of her famous quotes, I think, is she said, what's most important is that children in school learn to get into the habit of being happy. And most importantly, she and her progressive educators, fellow progressive educators, believed that the most important thing was to instill in a child the facility for independent thought so that they could become part of the American democratic experiment. Irwin and her colleagues pioneered the concept of school trips that we really all take for granted today. And the school trips that the Little Red kids took in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s were wildly ambitious. They went to auto auto factories to visit striking workers. And they went to steel mills, and they went to coal mines and would go down into the dark mines. The senior trip, which many of the alumni remember very fondly, was to Walden Pond, where they would get up at sunrise and listen to the teacher read Thoreau. Irwin died in an untimely way very soon after the high school of the lower school was opened in 1942. Now, she shared many of the free-thinking beliefs of her village neighbors, but she was never affiliated with any party, and in fact she shied away from organized political activity of any kind. However, by the 1940s and the 1950s, at the height of the McCarthy-era blacklist, many of the parents who enrolled their students at Little Red and EI, as Elizabeth Irwin High School was called, were writers and entertainers with distinct liberal, left, and indeed very left-leaning points of view. An example of this was Arthur Miller. Playwright Arthur Miller was a father in the school. Woody Guthrie sent his children to the school. Character actor Jack Guilford, I don't know if any of you know him, but he was blacklisted for many years, and he sent his kids to the school. Two other parents were Anne and Abel Mirapol, who had adopted the children of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg after they were executed in 1953 for espionage. So one of the children was actually in the same class as Elliot and Tom, the class of 1965. And the parents of Tom Hurwitz belonged to that sort of very rarefied group of parents. Leo Hurwitz was a documentary filmmaker of very left-leaning content, and Jane Dudley was a principal in the Martha Graham dance troupe. And Elliot, on the other hand, also in the class of 65, as I said, was a middle-class kid from Queens and the son of New Deal Democrats. His father was an immigration lawyer, his mother was a teacher, and he actually ended up going to Elizabeth Irwin in ninth grade because as a teacher she had heard of this sort of progressive, wonderful school. But he, as I said, really was sort of appalled by what he found there, and he and Tom sort of became arch enemies. And I'll read you a little bit to tell you a little bit about that. 35. In most American high schools in the early 1960s, the Abram family's politics would have put Elliot to the left of his classmates. At Elizabeth Irwin, he was the equivalent of a rock-ribbed Republican. Culturally, Elliot was also out of step. Like most of his classmates, he was Jewish, but unlike most of his classmates, who either came from secular families or were the product of mixed marriages, Elliot's family was observant and kept a kosher home. As the months went by, Elliot began to react to what he perceived to be the knee-jerk left-wing orthodoxies of the school. Browsing the magazine racks in the library, he saw progressive publications like I.F. Stone's Weekly and The Nation. Why, he asked Isabel Sewell, the sweet-faced librarian, could the school not achieve some balance in the publication it displayed? Why not stock a magazine like the National Review? The culture is dominated by right-wing politics, Sewell replied. We don't need to get more of it in the school. Elliot began to vocalize his own political views. He debated with his classmates in the basement cafeteria. His chief opponent was Tom Hurwitz, his equal in intellectual precocity and love of a good fight. The impromptu discussions often ended in shouting matches between the two. A hot topic in those lunchroom debates was Cuba and its leader Fidel Castro, who had come to power in 1959. Most EI students saw Castro as a romantic revolutionary who was bringing economic and social justice to his people. Elliot viewed him as just another standard issue communist dictator. Angela was a few years before them. She's a few years older, and she's in the class of 1961. And that was a rather remarkable class. And you have to remember, these classes were only about 35 kids each. The entire school only had about 160 or 70 kids in it from K to 12 at any given time. But that class included Robert De Niro, who went there for a while. His parents, he's sort of a self-created, his persona is not really accurate because his parents were both noted village artists in their day. and also Kathy Boudin was in their class. I don't know if you guys know who she is. She was a member of the Weather Underground, and in 1970 she disappeared after her involvement in an explosion that destroyed a Greenwich Village townhouse, killing 3 of her comrades. And she emerged from hiding 11 years later to take part in the infamous 1981 Brinks robbery, in which a guard and 2 policemen were killed. And for that, she served more than 2 decades in prison. In the book, I sort of tell I tell quite a bit about their school days, and then I follow them as they go on to lead these remarkably dramatic and event-filled lives, so much so that, it was either going to be a 2,000-page book or a 300-page book. So I ended up really sort of trying to capture the flashes of some of the more remarkable things that happened to them. At Columbia University, Tom was one of the student rebels who occupied Math Hall, one of the 5 buildings to be taken in the 1968 occupation and subsequent strike. He then moved to California, where he worked for several years as an activist against the war and for the GI movement, which involved organizing the troops who were growing in their opposition to the war, in part by starting what were called GI coffee houses, where they would meet and be able to talk to each other about what they had seen in the war and talk about what they felt about it. Did many other amazing things. He got involved in a very high-profile murder case, also in Southern California, and returned to New York in the 1970s and followed in his father's footsteps. He became a documentarian and a cinematographer, and worked on films, a lot of which had meant a lot of social impact. Harlan County, USA was one of the first films that he worked on, and he's still doing it and still very successful. Eliot, much to his pleasure, was accepted into Harvard and was the only person in his class to be accepted. And I think that he hoped that when he left EI and went to Harvard that he would find a group of more like-minded colleagues. But unfortunately for him, or maybe fortunately as things turned out, his college career coincided with the rise of the new left on campus, especially the SDS, which was an organization that he just loathed. To his mind, they combined Elizabeth Irwin's old left politics and this sort of new left brand of bitter anti-Americanism, which is how he saw it. As a matter of fact, these sort of new hippies that were newly converted hippies that he met at Harvard made him almost nostalgic for what he called the hereditary radicals back at EI. I mean, the way he figured it, at least they came by their politics honestly and weren't just in it for the girls and the drugs, etc. But in his undergraduate career and in his graduate career, he made a tight group of friends that would go on to become remarkably impactful in American history. They worked for Scoop Jackson's on his staff, and then on Daniel Patrick Moynihan's staff, and then and you have to remember they were still all Democrats at that point, albeit getting more and more conservative. Then they worked on Ronald Reagan's campaign, and when President Reagan won, they all moved into to that administration, and in varying combinations have really been there ever since in all of the subsequent Republican administrations, except perhaps for George H.W. Bush, and even there a little bit. In 1980s, he became the youngest assistant secretary of sort of inter-American affairs, or the youngest assistant secretary ever, really, and moved up very quickly under the wing of George Shultz. And but in the mid-'80s, he became very much involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. And many thought that scandal would end his career, but it didn't. Soon after George W. Bush came into power in 2000, he went back into the administration and remained there for 8 years, just as he remained in Ronald Reagan's administration for 8 years. And it's ironic. I mean, you could make the argument that he's the most effective activist that Elizabeth Irwin ever produced. And to this day, really still produces very high emotions in the class. And I'll read you this part about a class reunion in the year 2000 of the class of 1965. Page 242. At some point, as it always did at these gatherings, the talk turned to an absent classmate. It had been 9 years since Eliot pled guilty to misleading Congress, and some in the group were not above crowing about his fall from power. He got what he deserved, said Madeline Guilford, Jack's wife, chuckling about Eliot's 10 million misadventure with the Sultan of Brunei, which is another story. A classmate rose wryly to Eliot's defense. Well, none of us were ever any good at math. Long before his Iran-Contra problems began in 1986, Eliot had stopped coming to reunions. He found it tiresome to rehash the same old ideological fights and to be cast, as always, in the role of reactionary. I remember going to a reunion in '68 and people saying, "Are you for Eugene McCarthy?" And I said, "No." And I started to be abused for being for George McGovern. And when I said, no, that's not it, I'm for Humphrey, there was absolute silence. People thought for a moment, and then they realized it was a joke. It was a very funny joke. And I said, "No, it's not a joke." That was when they realized I was truly hopeless. His last contact with the school had been in 1992, when the school solicited alumni reminiscences for a publication celebrating the school's 50th anniversary. Among the fond, nostalgic memories submitted by other alumni, Eliot's entry stood out in sharp relief. The EIA attended in the 1960s had a reputation for social and political activism, but it was in precisely these areas that it failed its students, he wrote. The political bias, not only among the students, but much worse in the actual teaching of history and social studies, was pronounced, even scandalous. The inclusion of Eliot's remarks in the booklet sparked an uproar from his fellow alumni. One of them wrote in, "I guess the faculty can feel proud that they had as few spectacular failures as Eliot Abrams. I'm still embarrassed by this graduate's inability to learn any of the important lessons taught at EI. Why aren't you?" Other alumni missives expressed themselves far less politely, one of them in scatological terms. Decades after Eliot left EI, he still had the power to render his schoolmates apoplectic with rage. After graduating Elizabeth Irwin in 1961, Angela Davis went to Brandeis, a very similar sort of East Coast, almost all white and predominantly Jewish institution. And then she went to Frankfurt to complete her graduate studies. And she first rose to prominence when she got back to the States and moved to California, where she's made her life all these many years. She went head-to-head with then-Governor Ronald Reagan, when he and the California University Board of Regents fired her from her first teaching job at UCLA for her membership in the Communist Party of the United States of America. Very shortly thereafter, she became involved, and this was caused legal issues that went on for many, many, many years. So while she was duking that out with the Regents, she became involved in supporting the Soledad brothers. 3 convicts accused of killing a guard in Soledad Prison in Northern California. And she also began an intense emotional involvement with George Jackson, who was the most high-profile member of the 3 Soledad brothers. And just months after that, Eliot became a fugitive after she was charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy in connection with an attempted jailbreak in Marin County Courthouse by George's younger brother, Jonathan, in which he was killed and the other conspirators were killed and a judge was killed and an assistant district attorney paralyzed for life. 2 months later, she was captured in New York and spent 18 months in jail, and her trial was covered the world over. If they were calling things the trial of the century then, I think that would have been called the trial of the century. So the last selection, I'll read you about when she was caught in New York City after 8 weeks of running from the law. Re-entering the motel of Howard Johnson's on 10th Avenue, in the late afternoon, Angela noted impassive, dark-suited men milling about the lobby. She tamped down the now familiar feeling of panic that spread through her. She was probably imagining things. The stress of life as a fugitive had taken its toll. At this point, every white man in a suit seemed to her like an FBI agent ready to pounce. Resolutely, Angela made her way across the lobby and into the elevator. Exiting on the 7th floor, she spied a man peering out of one of the doors in the hallway. Another man, who had entered the elevator with her, followed her out. Suddenly, agents burst out of every room on the floor, converged on her, and shouted, "Are you Angela Davis? Are you Angela Davis?" One of them pulled a gun. Moments before, when Angela realized that her capture was imminent, an unexpected sense of calm had possessed her. Now there was a sickening moment of terror as she pictured her corpse, sprawled and bleeding on the cheap hallway carpeting. They brought Angela to the sterile FBI headquarters on East 69th Street, where she was kept for several hours before being driven downtown to the Women's House of Detention on 6th Avenue and Greenwich Street. No, that's 6th Avenue and Greenwich Avenue, a massive 10-story building that loomed over the townhouses and tenements of Greenwich Village. Disoriented as she was, Angela still recognized it. She had walked by it countless times on her way to Elizabeth Irwin High School as a teenager and vividly recalled the din made by the female inmates as they rained down curses and pleas from the many-windowed jail. Still handcuffed, Angela was placed on a bench in a grimy waiting area. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw her image on a paper flyer under the words, "Wanted by the FBI." If that wasn't surreal enough, directly next to it was a poster picturing her former classmate, Kathy Boudin. I also graduated from Little Red and Elizabeth Irwin in the late 70s, but I had no idea about the history of the school. And as I talked to other classmates, they didn't either. And I don't know whether that was sort of like a hangover from the 60s or 70s, or because some of the teachers were still there. But really, we didn't know anything about it. But years later, in the 90s, I returned to the school as alumni director, and I started to put together the archives. And that's when I started to learn about Elizabeth Irwin and the history of the progressive education. And I also started to meet the members of the classes of 1960s and start to organize their reunion weekends. And I was really hooked when I worked on the reunion weekend of the class of 1961. And the first thing that they did was meet on Friday at Grand Central Station en masse and take a train to see Kathy Boudin at Bedford Hills Prison. And that's when I realized that this was not your usual alumni class. As a matter of fact, one of the members of that class said, sort of ruefully, joking, but also in a sort of amazed way, it's not every class in America that has 6% of its number on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. So that's, I hope I've given you a taste of what the book is about, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for coming. Any questions?
Hi. I have two sisters who went to EI.
Oh, yeah?
One was class of 58, the other was class of 64. And the thing that shocked me most about EI was that they would come home and talk about their teachers. Ed said this, and Jim said that, and I was just floored. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the program that brought Angela Davis to EI. How did she get there?
There was a program sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee that brought promising young African American people, young people in the Deep South, and let them go to high school and junior high school in the North, because at the time, of course, in the South, there were two separate but unequal types of education for blacks and for whites, and so she found out about that. She knew she needed to get out of Birmingham. Even though when she had gotten out, she felt horrible guilt because this was she left just at the time of the Freedom Riders, and so she was very torn about that. So they gave her two choices. She could either have gone to Fisk University because she wanted to be pre-med at first, or she could go to Elizabeth Irwin. And she'd actually been to the city before that. Her mother was a teacher and would go to NYU some summers to work for her master's. So she decided to go to Elizabeth Irwin, and that's where she first read the Communist Manifesto, which had a tremendous impact on her. So it's just I mean, I asked her where, how she thinks her life would have turned out if she had gone to Fisk, but of course, that's the sort of question one can never answer.
You might be able to hear me from here.
Sure.
How did you decide on those three? I mean, obviously the liberal culture would affect your choices, but how did you pick those particular three to?
Well, there was an embarrassment of riches, and and I wanted to get a group of people from about the classes of 1960 to 1965, because I wanted them all going into college at around 68, which was sort of the peak of the counterculture movement in the college. And I wanted to have men and women. I wanted to have an African American, and it was sort of like a war movie, sort of one of everything. And I mean, I could have written about the Mirapoles. One was class of 60, the other was class of 65, but they had written their own stories. I mean, so Angela wrote her autobiography when she was 25. I mean, so much had happened to her by then. And Kathy Boudin was actually just getting out of jail when I started to work on this, and she had just had a major biography done, and also she didn't really want to cooperate, and I wanted to work with people who wanted to talk to me. And I've been working on this book for a long time. Eliot actually did speak to me quite a few times, although when he was in the George W. Bush administration, he didn't want to, for reasons that seem kind of reasonable to me.
What is progressive education?
Progressive education is, I mean, I think I covered that a little bit. I think it's learning by doing, and I think it is not just being on the receiving end of learning, being told what, but finding things out yourself, and that's where the school trips came in, and that's where sort of meeting. I mean, it's before the internet, it was going to the original sources. I think today it's sort of harder to know, because I think many of the elements of progressive education have been incorporated into the education that we have, although perhaps there's a real sort of going back on that now that we teach to the test a lot. But I mean, taking school trips and doing things like that, we don't really think twice about that, but it was very unusual back then.
Well, what you had mentioned was that they were against memorization, and you had quoted Eliot as to the basically sort of narrow-mindedness of the discussion atmosphere.
Well, he never, I mean, I think that's two separate things, because he, in that letter that I wrote you, what I didn't read is that he said, when it came to the humanities, when it came to the education that we got, EI was glorious. And I also, I don't know if this has to do with your question on progressive education, he really wasn't, he felt a lot of pushback for his views, but he really wasn't penalized. I mean, the teachers made him the editor of the school magazine, so.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, kind of?
Well, I probably need more, but
I wonder if you could go a little further on that. If you look at the students of the 40s and the 50s
Yes.
in that school, where did this kind of left-wing progressivism come from? From a leadership in the school? I mean,
It's a good question.
Why did somebody go from 178th Street? You gave an example in here. Somebody down to the Village for this. I mean, where did this atmosphere? It didn't.
How
just
did it get
happen.
the critical mass of those kind
and
of
then
people?
feed on it to go so that by the time the 60s, when there was turbulence, they were all set to accommodate that. I mean, My idea of a progressive school was Dalton, so you can imagine where I come from.
I think Dalton was a progressive school back
But
then.
not like this.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday I did a talk where I had 3 of the alumni, and one of them was from the class of 47, and she kind of made that same point, even though her teacher was her father was a teacher in the school and ran a sort of one of those left-wing summer camps, and he was investigated by HUAC and testified. But she said, it wasn't really about being a left-winger, it was about exploring ideas. And I think that when McCarthyism came, there was a real perceived and real sense that nonconformity was dangerous, even in New York. And I think Elizabeth Irwin had fostered an environment where independent thinking and ideas that weren't, on the beaten track were okay. I mean, I know that when I went there, and for many years, there was a huge picture of her when you would walk into the hallway, and there was a quote from her, and part of the quote was, we hope this will be a place where heresy will be looked on as possible truth. And I think that even though she wasn't left-wing or a communist, she was a bohemian, and she was interested in possible truth.
I graduated from EI in '69, and I want to thank you because, if for no other reason that when I would tell people stories about my experience for 12 years, they would think I was making it up. And I stopped talking about it to people because they, especially in Washington, D.C., New York, it was a more familiar experience. But in Washington, where I've lived for 30 years, it's hard to
there wasn't an old left sort of tradition in D.C.?
Old left, and I'm the only person I know around here, except I have one friend who went to EI with me. But, it's a very, it's so different that it's almost hard for people to cross the gap into believing that a school like this really existed. I mean, if Dalton was considered progressive, what was this considered?
Thank you. Also, at that talk last night was Carol Carter, who I think was in your class. So, yeah.
Did you say you're alumni director?
Yes.
Oh, are you still alumni director?
No. It was in the late '90s that I went there, and I was sort of in between careers. I had been in theater, and I decided that I wasn't ever going to make a living in theater, and so I sort of found myself here. But actually, writing about the alumni and finding out about them made me want to become a writer. So I applied to Columbia Graduate School in journalism, and they took me. So I'm a journalist today because of the school, really, by a very circuitous route.
How was the school different, if at all, during the time that you went there versus the time you focused on in this book, 60 to 65? Because I think you indicated something you were surprised about.
Remarkably different. I mean, Ed Savanto, who I think everybody talks about, I mean, he was still there, and he introduced us to sort of existentialist writers, and I think the curriculum was still wonderful, and I still am affected by that. But really, there was no politics. I mean, there's a part in this book where about the class of '65 where it says that petitions sort of went through the class at the rate of 2 and 3 per week, and on Saturdays would be spent at Woolworths, protesting the segregation at lunch counters. Their lives, and alumni last night was saying, we believed that we were going to change the world, and it was going to happen in our lifetime. And there was that feeling in the school that, that it would happen and that they could make it happen. So there was that sort of electricity and excitement that certainly wasn't there.
Well, it seems like it was more a societal change than an actual change in the school itself.
I think so. When the school started in 1932, the tuition was $125 a year. Does anyone want to guess what it is now? I mean, it's probably the same in $40,000 a year. the parent body. When I was there, there were a lot of, in the 60s when I read about it, there were playwrights and theater people and movie people. In the 90s when I was there as alumni director, there were a lot of visual artists, Bryce Martin and that ilk. Now there are a lot of people in banking. And I think that they have progressive views. But it's certainly not a revolutionary school anymore, and hasn't been for a while. There was a time in the 80s and the 90s when it was very difficult for the school to even admit to being progressive. Never mind, having parents who were communists or progressives or anything like that. Just saying that they were a progressive education institution was a little prickly, but I think they embrace that now. They've been very nice about this, so I guess they don't mind. Thank you all so much.